I'm going to launch into introducing our speaker today. Again, she may be familiar to some of you who are frequent Q&A with PNJ attendees because she is a fellow moderator and a really active member of our education committee. But she also has a very incredible professional background. She is the specialist professor of public history and primary point of contact for the public history minor at Monmouth University. And very specific to our topic today, she is the president of Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region. So she is going to be sharing a number of tips and tricks with us today on the session. And then we will end, as usual, with 10 to 15 minutes of time for everyone here to ask questions. So with that, I'm going to try a new feature today called spotlighting. I'm going to spotlight Melissa and I. So everyone hold on. Okay, let's see how this goes. And then we should just see the two of us while we have our conversation. All right. How's it look, folks?
Warning. It says the host has spotlighted you.
Do you see the two of us? Are we good?
I think we're good.
All right. So we'll get started. So first of all, Melissa, thanks for joining today. Can you share a little bit about just oral history and how it can be used to engage a community in a preservation project?
Yeah, so hi everybody. I just want to say, Emily, how much I love the introductions. I think that it's so useful and it makes this series so unique. So I'm so glad we do that. It is slightly nerve-wracking to be at the other end of the questioning today, so I will do the best that I can. If I may, before I directly answer Emily's question, I'd like to just briefly define what oral history is. Oral history collects memories and personal commentaries of historical significance through recorded interviews. An oral history interview generally consists of a well-prepared interviewer, and that's key, as I especially have to stress with my students, right? Questioning an interviewee or narrator, we sometimes call them, and recording the exchange in audio or video format. So the recording is key for this formal definition of oral history. The recordings are then summarized, transcribed, or indexed and placed in a library or archive. So oral history really requires a dialogue between two people. And oral history, unlike some other types of interviewing that scholars or researchers might do, is intended for use by the public. And your narrators are almost always identified. Again, unlike some other disciplines where anonymity is preferred, oral history is supposed to be about people wanting to share their stories, feeling empowered to share their stories. And then just two other points before we dive in. So we're here together today for roughly an hour, but you could take a day-long oral history workshop, or you could take a semester-long oral history class like I teach at Monmouth, or you could go to, say, Columbia University and get an entire master's degree in oral history. So while I certainly think today's event is very, very useful, we're not going to be able to cover everything. So, I want to point that out. I will, at the end, call your attention to some other resources you might use to get additional info you need. And of course, you'll have my contact information, and I'm happy to act as a sounding board and a resource for you. Oh, one more thing. So I've been doing oral history work since 2002, and I love this stuff. I am passionate about this topic. So if at any point I start going too quickly in my excitement, or I don't explain anything thoroughly enough, unmute yourself and just yell and let me know, okay? And I will slow down and I will clarify. So now that my opening monologue is done, I will get back to Emily's point. How can oral history be a community engagement project? Well, you can look at this two ways, right? People tend to be fascinated by oral history. Who doesn't like to listen to great storytelling, right? Sometimes when people say, oh, history is boring, it's because they don't think of history as great storytelling, right? They think of it as dry facts and figures, but people love human interest stories. And whether those stories are uplifting or difficult, they put a human face on the past. They make us feel something. And so oral history can provide fantastic content for your websites and blogs and social media, really pulling people into your site, creating interest in and a sense of engagement with your site. And then reaching out and actually asking people to share their stories. That's a whole nother level of engagement, right? And once people have been interviewed, I'd venture to say that they are more likely to stay involved with you, whether that means donating or volunteering their time or attending other programs, right? So there are a lot of different ways that you can engage your community using oral history.
I love that part of it. And to people that might say something like oral history is unreliable, which sometimes does get said, which I find hard to believe. But when we were talking and planning for this session, you mentioned that can be a critique. What do you say to people who say that?
I don't like that, right? But of course, it does come up. People say, "Well, how do you know you can trust anything that's said in an oral history?" And I usually counter that by agreeing with them. You know what? Yes, people could purposely lie in an oral history, or they could accidentally misremember things. But you know what? Every other source you are going to consult is subject to problems as well. Newspapers get things wrong. People fudge budgets. People, so every source has to be evaluated and compared against other sources. So yeah, is there the potential that errors could sneak into oral histories? Certainly, but that exists for every other source, books, diaries, newspapers, as I said. So you evaluate it as you do any other source.
I love that answer. And, we're thinking about the why, again, of the oral history project. So, there's incredible new information that you can get. There's community engagement elements to it. But how could oral histories contribute to an advocacy effort to save a site? Thinking about, the preservation of a site.
Yeah, so let's say you have a site that's potentially in danger, right? Doing a series of interviews with people who know about the significance of the building, for one, right? I mean, that documents the history of the site. And two, if your oral history efforts are promoted properly, you might generate enough interest in your project to make a difference. And I'm going to quote a paper here by Benjamin Marcus. He's an architectural conservator, and he says it far more eloquently than I probably could. So he writes, "While technology and historical documents are vital for recording and interpreting cultural heritage, living memory can convey both tangible and intangible aspects of a site, such as alterations, use, cultural significance, and meaning. Despite the widespread application of oral history in related fields, it is often ignored as a tool for documenting historic buildings and sites. However, because it records not only physical, but social, spiritual, and ritual phenomena, the oral history is essential to understanding the intangible and capturing the sense of place." So I love that. Your, architectural plans and your deeds and your tax records, they tell you something, right? But oral histories are going to flesh that out in a way that few other resources can. And if you wind up not saving the site, which, we always hope that doesn't happen, but if you wind up not saving the site, those oral histories provide an incredible record for future generations to still be able to appreciate what's been lost.
That's a great point. And I was just thinking, I actually live near the Cathedral Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Newark, and there's a book that documents all the people that were involved in building it and has interviews with them. And you're right, you get such a richer information than just kind of the date it was built, the building materials, like who was building it and what were their feelings while they were doing it. So thanks for adding that. So yeah.
I'm sorry, just before we leave this out, but to preservationists too, interview each other. Let the public know about the incredibly hard work that you are doing. Share your lessons learned with other preservationists. A great example of that is the New York Preservation Archive Project. I'll put the link in the chat for you if anybody wants to check that out later. Their website notes, "By collecting eyewitness accounts and personal impressions of moments in preservation history, the Archive Project aims to create a verifiable record of the movement and ensure that the work of preservationists is not forgotten." So oral history is good for specific sites, but it's also really good for the field in general.
That's a great point. So with your expertise in creating oral histories, and I'm going to launch into kind of the how of creating it and ask you some questions around that. So first, when someone's getting started, they might want to look and see if other oral histories have been done. How might folks find these existing oral histories that could help them understand the site?
How do we start anything, right? With the Google. In my undergraduate class, the students start the semester, they have to go out and explore existing oral history collections. And I always say, pick a topic you like. Do you like baseball? Are you fascinated by World War II? Like, search baseball oral history, search World War II oral history. Like, you'll be amazed by what you can find. The Smithsonian Institution runs a massive oral history program. There is the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. The Holocaust Museum has a massive oral history program, right? So there are many, many, many existing oral histories out there. You can find those collections. You know, you don't know what you'll find. If your site, for example, is associated with some particular famous person, right? You know, go out and search and see what oral history collections you can find. Now, if we're looking for hyper local history, there are oral history projects at the state, county, and local level as well. You know, right here in New Jersey, the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey has over 600 interviews of New Jersey's war veterans. You know, at the county level, both the Monmouth County Historical Association and the Monmouth County Archives, just, you know, I teach at Monmouth, so I'm just using that as an example, but they both run their own oral history collections. And then a lot of the local historical societies and libraries, they'll have their oral history collections as well. So get out there and explore. I think you'll be surprised at what is already out there. Unfortunately, there is no massive central database, right? Like WorldCat to search all of the libraries, right? Unfortunately, that does not exist for oral histories. We wish. The other thing I will point out is that what you are going to find online might vary. So some oral history programs will have full audio files and searchable transcripts up on there, and that's great. That'll make your work easier. Others might just have a list of people who've been interviewed, right? That's often dictated by funding. Others, you'll actually have to go and visit the site, right? But you should be able to get an idea of what's out there by starting with that simple, you know, basic Google search.
I love that. And yeah, and Googling, just another example of a place that you might not think to find an oral history, but there's actually an art gallery here in Newark that did an oral history project on a specific, it was called like it was an arc that somebody built basically in the city. But, you know, the gallery took it upon itself to do the oral history project. So you never really know what you'll find unless you do that Google search.
Yeah.
So for people that might be looking to get started, I know some people are, it sounds like, underway with projects right now. Some folks might have kind of projects that are coming up. What are some basic, just getting started tips that you would give us?
Yeah, so first you want to decide who kind of generally you seek to interview, right? So at Monmouth, I have the Monmouth Memories Oral History Program. I know that we want to interview alumni, past faculty, past employees, and community partners. When I was the command historian at Fort Monmouth, we interviewed military and civilians who had been stationed at the base, right? So generally figure out who you're interviewing towards what end. Figure out what kind of equipment you're going to use, right? How are you going to do this recording? Are you going to do audio or video? And we'll talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of each of those in a little bit. But it doesn't have to be difficult or expensive. I was at an oral history conference a few years ago, and there was a panel, a professor with her class, and they were talking about their oral history project. And she said she got a grant from the university and she was so excited. They got this money and she used the money to go and buy each student their own recorder, right, that they could record their interviews with. And the students were like, "Professor, why'd you do that? We could have just recorded it on our phones." And she was like, "What?" Like it hadn't occurred to her because it was when smartphones were like just coming out, right? So it doesn't have to be anything crazy. You can get decent, if you don't have a lot of money, you can get very decent quality audio simply on a smartphone app, right? And there are different apps that you can use. So figure out how you're going to record the interviews. Then you start looking for people who fit the bill, right? So, you know, use an example, the Ocean County Historical Society, they live in downtown Toms River in a Victorian era home, but the reason they got on the National Register in 2019 was because of their affiliation with Elizabeth Sculthorpe Force. She's a woman who had lived in the house at one point around the mid 20th century. And she was a local teacher who pioneered classes in like family life and social hygiene, they called them, stuff like that, right? So that's why the house got on the National Register. So they wanted to do interviews with her students, right? So figure out who the type of people you're interviewing and then start going to find them, right? However, you have to track them down. When you are setting up your interviews, most projects are usually kind of short on time and resources, right? And you're trying to figure out who you want to interview first. Think about the age of the narrators, right? Obviously you want to do older people first. And think about their proximity to the subject, right? There are some people who are going to be further removed, some people who you suspect will have more critical stories to tell, right? So be thoughtful about the order in which you want to interview people. I always think it's a good idea to do a few interviews, like 2 or 3, start to finish. So what do I mean? The full recording, full transcript, or whatever you're going to do at the end, so that you have a product to then show either people who might be interviewed or potential funders, right? Are you going to go to the town and ask them to kick in a little money? Well, show them, hey, look what we've done, right? Are you putting in for a grant? You have an example, look what we're going to do, right? So that's usually a good idea. So once you have identified the people that you want to interview, what comes next, right? So you set up your interview. I always suggest, and I mentioned this earlier, that you do a lot of pre-interview research. You want to ask these people good questions, relevant questions, because it helps establish a rapport with them, right? It shows that you cared enough to research them, which is key to a good interview, establishing a good rapport. And it just makes for a better interview. When my students are doing Monmouth Memories, oral history interviews, for example, I say, if a student, if an alum didn't arrive to Monmouth until the 1990s, you don't want to ask them how they felt when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to campus, right? Because they don't know. And that just makes you look unprepared, right? So make sure that you tailor your questions to the individual narrator. Be thoughtful about where you're going to do the interview. There are a few considerations. Logistically, you want a place that is quiet and distraction-free, right? So you don't want to do it at the Starbucks. You want to balance the narrator's comfort with your safety and utility, right? So do you feel safe going to an elderly narrator's home because you know they'll be comfortable there, right? Flip side though, in their home, is there going to be a ringing phone and a barking dog, right? So these are all different considerations you want to weigh as you consider where the best place to do the interview is. Always a good tip, if possible, to use 2 recorders in case one fails. I have just like an old iPhone that, nobody uses anymore, and I turned it on just to use the recording app because, goodness forbid something happens with the tech and now you have to tell this poor person, sorry, I don't have your interview. So I always like to have 2 running if at all possible. Have a pad and pen. It sounds so simple, right? But so you can be taking notes while you are listening to the interview and asking good follow-up questions, because you're not bound to the question list that you came up with originally. You should be asking good follow-up questions as the interview goes on. This is a hard one for me. Don't rush, right? Allow there to be a moment of silence at the end of a question, right? We tend in society to find silence awkward, but when someone finishes a sentence, appears to have finished a sentence, let a beat or 2 go by, because you will often find that they will begin to talk again. They might have another thought occur to them, right? So embrace the potentially awkward silence. And then I always like to end with, is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered, right? Something like that kind of leaves the ball in their court and makes sure that they've been able to say everything they want to say. Generally, you want your interview to be like 1 hour to 2 maximum. Some oral historians are comfortable with 2 hours. I usually like to keep it closer to 1. I think after that, people just start to kind of get fatigued, both the interviewee and the interviewer. If it's someone that you are doing a whole life interview with, you know, let's say it's someone from your town who has a career in town politics for decades, right? And you've got a lot of ground to cover. Well, maybe then you schedule a series of interviews. But if you go on for too long, everyone's going to get fatigued and just start rushing through the process. And then you want to figure out what your plans are post-interview. We'll talk a little bit more about transcription in a moment, but are you going to do full verbatim transcripts? Where are you going to archive these copies? What will access look like? You know, where do your access agreements live, right? Because you'll want to make sure that both the interviewer and interviewee have signed an access agreement dictating who's going to own the copyright, what the permissions for use will be, right? So make sure you've got that all thoughtfully planned out in advance. At the end too, it's always very nice to share a copy of everything with the narrator. So whether that is audio or audio and transcript, you know, share a copy with them. It often becomes like a treasured resource for families. Yeah, so that's very quickly, in a nutshell, running through the oral history process.
No, that's great. And I know we're going to go into detail now on some of those things that you mentioned. So talking about technology, how do you recommend people record audio interviews or video interviews?
So I said at the beginning that oral historians don't agree on everything, right? So what's better, audio only or video? So this is one of the things oral historians can disagree on. I like, and that's not to say this is right, but I tend to prefer audio only. I think it is often logistically easier to handle, right? Rather than worrying about extra equipment and setup and who's in the frame and is it blurry. But the big thing for me is I think that people are more comfortable and candid if they can kind of forget that the recording is even happening, okay? Right now, I'm looking at myself, I'm like, is my double chin there? Am I like, right? When you're on video, it can be slightly awkward. And so I find when I'm interviewing people and they know they are on video, they're always worried about their posture and they, you know, they just can't relax as much as they can if it's just a phone sitting on the table between us that they can almost forget is there, right? Now, on the flip side, I will admit the perspective of those who prefer video interviews is, well, you get to see if they are smiling, if they tear up, are they someone like me who gestures rapidly with their hands, right? Like it tells you a little bit about the person. So, you know, that's a decision that you'll have to make with your team, what you're more comfortable with.
Right. And I would imagine too, like how it's going to be displayed, right? Like if it's, I'm thinking about the Holocaust Museum, I know they have like almost like a hologram where people tell their stories. Like they had to do the video for that, but then, right, if it's put on headphones, maybe the audio is better. So that's interesting to think about. Yeah.
Yeah. If you know, so I was just talking with my students earlier in the day about pure oral history. So are the oral histories being done just to capture the stories and live in the archive, or are they being done for a project? If they're being done specifically for like a documentary, they probably want video because they know it's going to be in the documentary. So that's something you'll have to consider as well, certainly.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned transcripts. Now we're going to come back to that. Is it necessary to make transcripts?
So when we were doing introductions, somebody said they'd been hard at work on transcripts, and I wanted to applaud them because doing transcription work is very, very hard. I have done it. It takes roughly 6 to 8 hours to transcribe 1 hour of audio because you are listening and you're going back and you're listening again. Now, some people might get really good at it and do it faster than that, right? But the textbook I use uses that as a rule of thumb, 6 to 8 hours to transcribe 1 hour of audio. It is labor-intensive work. Now, there might be some software you use, you know, to help you fast forward and stop. There's foot pedals you can get so that you can keep your hands on the keys and you can be stopping and fast forwarding and rewinding the audio via the foot pedals, right? But it's really painstaking work. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Do you have someone who is willing to do the work, or do you have the funds to outsource it? There are 2 companies I use. that transcribe for $1 a minute, and it's all virtual. I upload the file to them and they send me a Word document back. So, you know, you have to consider that. The transcript is very, very useful. Often you will find that researchers want the transcript rather than the audio. And this is another debate oral historians have. What is the oral history? The pure video or the transcript that was created? Researchers, though, almost unanimously like the transcript because you can read faster than you can listen. You can potentially keyword search, right, to find things that you're looking for quicker. So do you have to have a transcript? You don't, right? If you know you don't have the time or the funds to make a transcript, that should not stop you from preserving, collecting those stories, right? But if you can find a way to do it, you will find that it makes your collection much more user-friendly. If you can't do a full verbatim transcript because you don't have the time, right? No one's willing to volunteer, you don't have the money to outsource it, there are other things you can do. So the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey, for example, my students often partner with them. They'll listen to an interview and then they will take notes. And this is approved by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. So they will write, for example, 1 to 3 minutes talks about early life. 3 to 5 minutes talks about being drafted. 5 to 7 minutes talks about basic training. So again, someone who's potentially interested in using this interview in their research doesn't have to listen to a whole hour, can say, I'm looking for experiences in basic training. I have to go to the 5 to 7 minute mark. The other thing that the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey does is post on their website narrative summaries. So again, when my students partner with them, or you know, their other volunteers do this as well, they'll listen to the interview and then just type up a summary. Again, putting this on the web allows people to get a feel for the narrator's story and also decide if it's worth it for them to go access the whole thing for whatever project they're working on. Another option is just to have someone listen and jot down keywords. Okay, so that might be how you archive them by, you know, name. This is an interview with Melissa Ziobro on November 19th. She discusses oral history preservation, you know, and just have some keywords. The idea is so that potential researchers know what you've got there. If you can't do a transcript, there are other ways to make that clear to them.
Interesting. And now when another kind of question about the process, are you someone who believes that group interviews make sense, or is it a one-on-one preferable?
No, most oral historians will advise you against group interviews for a few reasons. If it is audio only, it is a disaster to transcribe when you're going to listen, you know, because people rarely identify themselves before they speak, so it gets very messy quickly. The other thing you want to consider is like groupthink. And now some people might say that's a good thing. Oh, well, you're jogging each other's memories. Are you though, or do you really remember something, or do you just go, oh yeah, Bob said it, I guess that's what happened, right? So it's better to interview people individually versus in a group if at all possible.
Interesting. Now,
even married couples, like, again, I'm sorry.
No, that's interesting.
Just choose. Better to separate them and let them tell their own story without outside influence.
They might remember things differently, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about, you know, having helpers potentially, or, you know, assistants for the transcription process, equipment. What do you recommend people budget for an oral history project?
It depends. You really could do this on a shoestring budget if you had to, right? If you have staff already or volunteers who are willing to undertake the work, right, then that's not an added cost. You could use free smartphone apps. You could use Zoom video recording technology, right? And you could either transcribe in-house or not transcribe, right? So you could do this on a shoestring budget and capture important stories if you have to. If you've got money to spend, on the other hand, you can buy, you know, documentary quality recording equipment, and you can pay people to do the interviews, and you can pay people to do the transcription, right? So it runs the gamut. But my main point would be for our audience today is if you don't have a lot of money budgeted for this, please don't let that dissuade you from doing this important work.
Another question about the process: should all interviewees be asked the same question? I think you mentioned a little bit, don't be afraid to go off of your set question base, but do you recommend always starting with the same questions?
Yeah, so in some disciplines, when they're doing research, they want, now they would call them informants in some other fields, right? We don't like that term in oral history, but they want their informants to only answer the same exact questions because they're looking for very specific results and they want to compare. But oral history is in the humanities, not the social sciences, right? So no, we tend to say, individualize your questions to your narrator, make them really relevant to them, and then be willing to deviate from that list and ask follow-up questions as appropriate throughout the interview. Now, to make it a little easier for yourself, you might have a set question list, like, okay, this is my starting point, and then you tailor it as appropriate. But you shouldn't feel that you have to ask everyone the same exact questions at all.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of doing your research, right? That you talked about. Now, for people that are working on these projects, right, it might be challenging at first to find people to listen to, right, to record. Do you have any tips for people that are actively seeking people to participate in their projects?
Yeah, just be creative. I mean, the internet age makes it much easier on us than it would have been for oral historians, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Get on social media, harness social media, put an ad in your local newspaper, right? Reach out to local nursing homes. A great tip is when you interview someone, at the end of the interview, ask them if they have anyone who would be another potential narrator, right? That works a lot. I mean, it works with any group, but I'm thinking in particular of veterans, right? There would be people I'd interview who had served at Fort Monmouth, and I'd say, so do you keep in touch with anyone from when you served here? And they'd give me 5 guys, right? So get creative, harness the internet, and work your existing interviewee pool.
Awesome. So now we're heading towards the end of our time, and I just have 2 more questions kind of regarding resources and examples. So the first is, and I think you've mentioned a couple already, but can you give any examples of sites in New Jersey that use oral histories really well in their educational materials that people might want to take a look at?
Yeah, so I'll just speak from experience of just a few projects I've been involved in, not to say they're done really well, but because I can speak from experience. So we mentioned the Ocean County Historical Society. They get on the National Register because of their association with this teacher, Elizabeth Sculthorpe Force, so they seek to do interviews with her students. Another example would be the Monmouth County Park System was reinterpreting Battery Lewis in Hartshorn Woods Park. It was this coastal defense battery in the World War II era. Very little known about it, so we sought, they engaged with me, and we sought to interview people who had served there. We were able to, for example, interview the woman who had served as the commander's secretary as they were building the site. I mean, how cool is that, right? And now excerpts of those oral histories became part of the interpretive panels up there in the battery. Awesome, right? Brings this piece of military history to life for people, for even kids. On opening day, I think of kids crawling through this World War II battery and they're looking at stories, right? Another example, again, another exhibit example, I did an exhibit for the Monmouth County Historical Association on the 5th anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. And the Historical Association had not done a tremendous amount of artifact collection in the aftermath of the storm. So we did a series of close to 40 oral history interviews with people who had been impacted by the storm, from first responders to people who lost their homes, to people who worked in the many charities that sprung up in the aftermath of the storm. And then we used those. I mean, those were really the heart of the exhibit, Tracking Sandy, Monmouth County Remembers. And so the whole exhibit was based around giving people a platform to share their memories. It wasn't the Historical Association telling people how the storm was. It was the Historical Association providing a platform for the people to speak. So I think that's when, sites use oral history in the best way. You do the oral history work, that's important. archive it properly, that's important too, but put it out there in some public way. As I said earlier, whether that's your social media, your blog, you write newspaper articles about it, or you do an exhibit using your oral history, right? Get it out there. Don't just stick it in a Gray Hollinger box like the ones behind me and get there.
That's great. Yeah, just another interesting way to get it out there is I went on a tour. It was called the Queer Newark Oral History Project Tour, and we toured downtown, and at different sites, people actually read transcripts of interviews of people that had been at that bar or sat in that park, and it was very interesting. So I love that. I love that what you said about making like a pedestal, right? You create a platform for people to get those stories out.
Yeah.
And now, I know you've been putting some items in the chat, or maybe we'll have to, hopefully people can see those. What are some of resources that you refer to people if they have questions?
So there are a ton of books and resources out there, but if I was picking some just to kind of get you started, Don Ritchie's Doing Oral History is the first link I put in the chat. It's really a very accessible kind of soup to nuts overview of how to do this work. For legal issues, I like John Neuschwinder, and I apologize to John, wherever he is, if I'm mispronouncing his name, Oral History and the Law. That's the second link I gave you there. It's a very slim text, but it goes over very important issues about copyright and privacy and libel and things like that. And then the professional organizations are there to help you as well, whether you contact them or whether you just comb their website for best practices and tips. The Oral History Association is kind of the national level professional organization, and then Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region is a more localized one. That's the one that I'm involved with. So their websites are in the chat as well. Reach out to them or just browse their websites, and then I'll put my email.
I have it on the slide. Yep. Yeah, I'll put it there. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Got it on the slide. Okay. If anyone wants to reach out to me directly with more specific questions, I'm more than happy to help.
Awesome. So I'm going to unspotlight Melissa and I. Let's see if we can figure it out.
It's 1:46. We did such a good job.
I know, we're right on time. So maybe I just spotlighted myself. Cancel the spotlight. I don't know. So I'm going to have everyone feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have a question. It can be specific. We have about 15 minutes to really talk amongst ourselves, or even if you want to share something that you've done.
Yes, I would love to hear more about some of the projects you've mentioned.
Yes. Billy, you want to unmute? Oops, you're muted. You're muted, Billy. Oh, unmute.
There we go.
There we go.
This is terrific. I got to tell you, that was like mind bending. You really hit it, Melissa. That's pretty much like everything that you want to start out with. And one of the things I want to urge people to understand is that history is age related. So when you started out to say, get the older people first, that's important, because first of all, they're going to have that long history, that age related history that they can relate. And that's the stuff we really want to get. I think somebody told me way back, they said, there's stories, there's history, and then there's historic preservation. And that's the way it kind of works its way down. You get some kind of wild thing that someone says, and then suddenly it becomes real history, and then it becomes a tool for historic preservation. So that's important. The other thing is that as a photographer, I will tell you, the magic word is push the button. Just push the button. Be prepared to push the button, meaning do your research beforehand, but do not stop yourself from pushing the button. That's what photography is. That's all it is. That's what this is, meaning make sure you motivate yourself to do that capture. That's really important. The last thing I would say is that if you're looking for resources, human resources, go to Craigslist or Facebook or other places and ask people if they want to do a project with you so that they can have pieces for their portfolio. I can't tell you how many times I have been suckered into doing projects because I thought this would be a great portfolio piece for me. So, try and find people of like mind and they will help you. There's people out there that are editors, that are, you know, audio editors, and you'll get better and better at it. But do the first one first, and then you'll see how it works.
Awesome.
It's
Thanks,
addicting,
Billy.
and it's so fulfilling. It becomes almost addicting. Off of Billy's point about reaching out to people, reach out to local colleges and high schools as well. And you may find that a class is willing to adopt your project and work with you. And that's a tremendous experience for the students and some free help for you.
I use as an audio recorder, which is, you know, and I use this professionally, you know, in jobs. I use a Zoom HR4, I think it is. And this is just a small recorder. Where is it? It's got to be around here somewhere. But this is really, you know, it's just push the button and we're going.
Awesome.
And it will give you great results. I mean, you know, it'll give you really great results if you work with it, but it'll give you exceptional results just putting it between yourself and another person and hitting the button.
I see somebody has their hand up here. Linda?
Thank you. What about doing interviews with people from other countries, people who are immigrants, and the process of translation? I had the opportunity to interview a number of Iraqi refugees, and some of them, their language was not, their English wasn't good enough, so they did it in Arabic. I'm just curious, what are sort of standards, especially for getting published?
Wow, that's an incredible opportunity you had. So if possible, it is best to have the narrator and the interviewer speak the same language, right? So that if you are going through a translator, things are not lost in translation. If you have to go through a translator, okay, you work with that. The other issue comes when it's time to transcribe, right? And you are transcribing a different language into English, right? So I don't have any hard and fast rules for you, except to say, you know, you've got to proceed very cautiously to ensure that you're not altering at any point the meaning of the narrator's words as you are translating back and forth and then transcribing.
Great, thank you. Do you know any places that are collecting oral histories for immigrants to the U.S.?
So the National Park System runs a large oral history program based on immigration in Ellis Island. Let me reach out to somebody there and see if they're still accepting stories. What was your name?
My name's Linda Lotz.
Okay.
I'll email you.
Yes, email me because I want to put you in touch with someone there. And if not there, we'll find you another place. One thing I'd like to, just bouncing off Linda's comment, is if you can cross-archive your interviews, that's wonderful, right? Because the more places they live, the more likely they are to be accessed, to be used, right? So don't be afraid to allow your interviews to live at more than one place. At Monmouth, we're going to be doing a series of interviews looking at how people in Asbury Park were impacted by COVID. So those will live at Monmouth. We're going to give them to the Asbury Park Library, to the Asbury Park Historical Society, right? The more places they are, the better that you can tell those stories.
That's a great point. Eileen, I think, waved.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment when you were talking about volunteers and getting how to save the information. A good resource, if you can reach out to, is a court transcriber. We had a member, we've just lost her, they've moved, but she was invaluable. Her day job was a court transcriber. And to take oral histories, she could type up for us.
Oh, wow.
Into a format. So, you know, check your membership or friends of members if you have somebody who give a, because frankly, we never thought of it till she's only been a member for a couple of years. We go, hey, I'll do that for you. The temptation is to overrun her, overwhelm her with everything, but just a something that you may never think of looking for.
That's a great suggestion.
That's interesting. Similar skill set, right? Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it never ever occurred to us. And I was like, who knew we had one? You know, exactly.
Does anyone have anything else they want to add, or questions, comments? No? Tina?
Yes. will we receive Melissa's email address and your email address?
Yes, and let me put this, I'll put the screens up here. I usually do this at the beginning, but I was so excited I forgot. So let me move this to get this started. So here is Melissa's email address. So you have it right here on the screen if you want to jot it down. So that, and she also put it in the chat, but here it is kind of bigger, right? And yep, so you can find it there. If you want.
By any chance, will we have a presentation to be sent out or anything like that?
So we could send out the recording. We did record today, which again, I should have mentioned that at the beginning. We do record these sessions, all of them, and they live on YouTube afterwards. It takes me usually a couple days to get it kind of up online. So we can send this out if that would be helpful.
You know what, Emily, in case people didn't nab the links out of the chat, I can put together a quick tip sheet and resource guide that we could email to all registrants, if that's okay with you, Emily.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Yep, that's fine. Yep. So I can make sure we coordinate that way.
Thank you so much.
Yes, no, for sure. And just to let everyone know, so we do have one more Q&A with PNJ coming up on December 10th, which will be with Dr. Doris Carpenter, who was involved in the Save Camden High School section, actually one of PNJ's 10 most endangered historic sites. Some people might be familiar with PNJ, but maybe others aren't. So just quickly about us, we are a member-supported organization founded in 1978, and we offer a variety of different kinds of memberships, a lot of educational programming, just like this today. In normal times, we do a lot of outdoor events as well, like tours and kind of more social events. And so there's a lot of different ways to engage with us. And if you want to email me, info@preservationnj.org, that goes to both me and Dale Perry, who's also here on the call, and one of us will return your call. So let's see if I can stop the share. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much to Melissa for this. It was really incredible, I think, presentation and overview of this topic. And so we will make sure we send you this recording afterwards and any resources that Melissa pulls together for us. So thank you, Melissa. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. Oh, thank you for being here.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Now I gotta figure out how to end it.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.